The last thing I saw were the rows of 6th and 7th graders all high-fiving as I leave.
The last thing I saw were the people that got held back.
The last thing I saw was the long, depressing hallway.
The last thing I saw was the school disappearing from sight as the bus drove away.
The last thing I saw was teachers and groups cheering that we have left.
The last thing I saw were the faces of students I would never see again.
The last thing I remember was living next door to my best friend.
The last thing I saw were the friends all going their separate ways.
The last thing I saw was easy to make up grades and extra credit.
The last thing I saw was a cold gym full of impatient teens rushing to grow up.
The last thing I felt was a friend hugging me goodbye.
The last thing I saw was a teacher who wrote me up more than one time for being late to class, and a smile on my parents' faces saying congrats like it had never happened.
The last thing I saw was the blank room that once held my favorite literary quotes and poems.
The last thing I felt were the hugs from teachers I secretly hated.
The last thing I saw were the barren white walls that enclosed the hallways I had been through so many times.
The last thing I saw were my friends getting more and more sad throughout the last day.
The last thing I saw were a bunch of excited 8th graders really happy because they were graduating.
The last thing I heard was the sigh of immense relief I gave out as I took bold strides in the opposite direction, never to return to that wretched place again.
The last thing I saw were kids crying over their fear of high school.
The last thing I saw was a boy who pulled down his pants to moon everybody on my bus because no one cared to ride him up.
The first thing I saw were seniors trying to intimidate me. P.S. It didn't work.
The first thing I saw was a girl running into the bathroom to throw up. I guess she was nervous.
The first thing I felt was the quintessential anxiety of new experiences.
The first thing I saw was the gross orange and blue colors.
The first thing I smelled was the horrible scent of the people who attend this school.
The first thing I heard was the obnoxious banter of my fellow victims of the American education system.
The first thing I remember was the purgatorial boredom of getting my schedule made.
The first thing I smelled was dry erase markers ready to write all the difficult problems of the year.
The first thing I smelled was desperation and Axe body spray.
The first thing I saw was a long hallway filled with fear and depression.
The first thing I saw was a teacher who I was happy to see yet scared to talk to.
The first thing I saw was people trying to fit in.
The first thing I saw was a school that seemed to stretch for miles.
The first thing I heard was the bustling of the daily breakfast routine.
The first thing I remembered was that I was glad I lost the people I did.
The first thing I felt was exciting and nervous all at once.
The first thing I remember was the feeling of joy that overcame me when I was reunited with my best friend from the 3rd grade.
The first thing I smelled was depression and stupidity.
The first thing I saw was the excitement in kids' eyes to learn.
The first thing I smelled was the 10 or 20 different fruity or masculine body sprays as I walked by.